Blood runs black beneath a desert moon. The war ended for most men when they laid down their rifles on European soil, but for some it merely changed battlefields. In the vast, unforgiving territories of the American Southwest, old ghosts walk with iron hands and cold eyes carrying vendettas as ancient as the red rocks themselves. There are no heroes here, only survivors. Men who return from the mud of France with darkness in their souls and blood on their ledgers. Men who learn that loyalty and betrayal are separated by a line as thin as a trigger's pull. They say vengeance rides a pale horse, but they're wrong. It rides in army trucks with machine guns. It hangs men from telegraph poles as warnings. It rings from mission bell towers at dusk, calling not to prayer, but to reckoning. Some debts can only be paid in lead. Some sins can only be washed clean with fire. And some men must become the very monsters they once fought against to protect what little remains of their humanity. Dust devils swirled across the cracked earth like ghosts of the long dead. Frank Rattler. Harmon watched them dance through the heat waves rising from the canyon floor, his weathered face revealing nothing. The man they once called lieutenant now wore a leather duster instead of a uniform, his military-issue binoculars the only remnant of a life abandoned, a life stolen. 300 feet below the narrow passage of Phantom Ridge stretched like a throat waiting to be cut. Frank's mount shifted beneath him, sensing his tension. Not the standard-issue cavalry horse he'd once ridden into battle, but a Mustang half-wild and desert-smart. He patted its neck with a gloved hand. "Easy, girl." His voice was gravel, worn smooth by whiskey and desert wind. Behind him, 5 riders waited in formation, their faces shadowed beneath wide-brimmed hats. The Serpent Riders, once soldiers, now outlaws. Men with nothing left but loyalty to each other and the hunger for something resembling justice. Miles, the youngest at 23, edged his horse closer. Nervous energy rippled through him like heat lightning. "You sure about the intelligence boss? Army patrols don't usually run this deep into Navajo territory." Frank didn't lower the binoculars. "This ain't a standard patrol, Miles." A flash of sunlight on metal caught his eye. The convoy was coming, right on schedule. Frank collapsed the binoculars with a practiced motion. "Charlie, you got the Thompson ready?" Charlie Blackburn, a former machine gunner with haunted eyes, patted the drum-fed submachine gun strapped across his chest. Not regulation equipment for the U.S. Army, a souvenir from their last raid on a weapons transport. "Oiled and loaded, Lieutenant." Frank didn't correct him. Charlie still slipped sometimes, calling him by his old rank. Some ghosts never fully fade. Elena Frank called to the lone woman among them. She wore men's riding clothes, her dark hair tucked beneath her hat, eyes calculating. "Signal's yours. When you're ready." Elena Reyes nodded once, checking the mirror she'd positioned to catch the sun. Frank turned to address them all, his voice low but carrying on the desert air. "Remember, we're after the payroll. Clean and quick. Army personnel are secondary targets only if they resist." He looked each man in the eye. "This money gets my sister back. After that, anyone who wants out, I understand." Dwight, the oldest among them at 45, spat tobacco juice into the dust. "We're with you, Rattler. All the way to hell if that's where this leads." Frank nodded. The weight of their loyalty sat heavier than any command he'd ever carried. "Jack, get the Indian warmed up." Jack Clemens grinned, revealing a gold tooth that flashed in the sun. He dismounted and moved to the canvas-covered shape behind a cluster of rocks. With a flourish, he pulled away the covering to reveal a 1917 Indian Power Plus motorcycle, its red paint dulled by dust, but its chrome pipes gleaming like silver veins. "She's ready to sing, boss," Jack said, patting the leather seat. The machine was an anachronism in this ancient landscape man's newest weapon against the oldest terrain on Earth. Frank turned back to the ridge. Down below, the first vehicle in the convoy appeared around the bend. A Ford Model T converted for military use canvas top opened, 2 soldiers visible in the front seats. Behind it, a 6-horse wagon heavy by the look of how the wheels bit into the packed dirt, then unexpectedly a second wagon, and behind that a Packard staff car. Frank's jaw tightened. The intelligence had mentioned only one wagon. He raised the binoculars again, focusing on the staff car. A young officer sat in the back, his uniform pressed and clean, despite the dust. Lieutenant's bars gleamed on his collar. Something in the officer's bearing struck Frank as familiar, but he couldn't place it. 2 wagons and a staff car, he muttered. Someone important's along for the ride. Charlie shifted uncomfortably. We calling it off? Frank studied the convoy again. 6 men in the trucks, 4 with each wagon, 2 in the staff car. No, he decided. More men, but the plan still works. Just means we need to be faster, cleaner. He turned to Elena. Wait for my signal, then light 'em up. Frank mounted his horse and took one last look at his men. Not soldiers anymore. Something harder. Something forged in betrayal. Ride with me today and there's no going back, he said, his voice barely audible above the desert wind. The army will hunt us. That payroll is blood money one way or another. But it's the only way I get Margaret back from Pierce. No one looked away. No one flinched. Frank nodded once, then drew his Colt 1911, another relic from the war, and fired a single shot into the air. The plan unfolded like clockwork. Elena's mirror flashed once, twice, 3 times signals to the men positioned at the far end of the canyon. Almost immediately, the sound of a rock slide echoed through the narrow passage. The convoy jerked to a halt as boulders crashed down, blocking the road ahead. Frank reared his horse a silent signal, and the serpent riders charged down the steep slope, sending cascades of rock and dust ahead of them. At the same moment, Jack kick-started the Indian motorcycle, its engine roaring to life like a mechanical beast. The soldiers below reacted with military precision weapons, coming up, orders being shouted. But they were looking the wrong way, expecting the attack from the direction of the rock slide. Frank's horse hit the canyon floor at a full gallop, his duster billowing behind him like dark wings. He fired twice from the saddle, taking down the driver of the lead vehicle. Charlie opened up with the Thompson, the staccato rattle of automatic fire, bouncing off the canyon walls, amplifying into the sound of 100 guns. The soldiers scrambled for cover, returning fire in ragged bursts. A bullet whined past Frank's ear, close enough that he felt its heat. He leaned low over his horse's neck, guiding her with his knees, while both hands worked his pistols. Jack roared down the slope on the motorcycle, whooping like a madman, a bandolier of dynamite strapped across his chest. He circled the second wagon, drawing fire, then tossed a lit stick beneath it. The explosion lifted the wagon a foot off the ground, horse screams mixing with the shouts of men. Frank rode straight for the staff car. The young officer inside was on his feet now, pistol drawn but eyes wide with the shock that comes to men who've never seen real combat. The driver gunned the engine, trying to turn the vehicle around, but the narrow canyon left little room to maneuver. Frank leapt from his horse onto the hood of the car, his weight smashing the windshield. The driver's face disappeared in a spray of red as Frank fired through the glass. The young officer managed one wild shot that grazed Frank's shoulder before Frank's boot connected with his chest, sending him sprawling onto the dusty road. Around them, the battle raged. Elena had circled behind the soldiers, picking them off one by one with sniper precision. Miles and Dwight had taken control of the lead wagon, while Charlie provided covering fire from behind a boulder, the Thompson's drum almost empty. The young officer scrambled to his feet, his hat gone, sandy hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. He raised his pistol again, hands steady, now finding his courage. U.S. Army, he shouted. Surrender, or... Frank shot him through the heart. The officer's body jerked, his final expression, one of surprise rather than pain. He crumpled to the ground, blood blooming across his pristine uniform like a desert flower. For a moment, Frank stood over him, something tugging at his memory. Something about the eyes. Rattler! Charlie's voice broke through. We got company. At the far end of the canyon, beyond the rock slide, dust clouds signaled approaching riders. Reinforcements. Frank shook off his momentary hesitation. Jack, get that payroll. Jack dismounted from the motorcycle and ran to the first wagon now under their control. He ripped open a wooden crate and whistled. It's here, holy Christ, it's all here. Frank knelt beside the fallen officer, searching his pockets for identification. His fingers closed around a small leather wallet. Inside was a photo, a stern-faced older man in a colonel's uniform standing beside the young officer. On the back, written in precise handwriting, Thomas and Victor Blackwood, West Point, 1920. The blood drained from Frank's face. Thomas Blackwood, son of Colonel Victor Ironhand Blackwood, the man who had ordered the massacre at Heidelheim, who had court-martialed Frank when he refused to execute German civilians. The man who had destroyed his military career with a single command. And Frank had just killed his only son. "Boss!" Miles called out, urgency in his voice. "We gotta move." Frank pocketed the wallet and ran to his horse. "Mount up, Jack. Bring the Indian. We ride for Devil's Creek." As they galloped away, the single surviving soldier crawled from beneath the overturned wagon. With shaking hands, he dragged himself to the young officer's body. "Lieutenant Blackwood," he whispered, closing the dead man's eyes. "God help us all when the colonel finds out." Colonel Victor Blackwood stood motionless at the window of his office, hands clasped behind his back, as rigid as the iron prosthetic that had replaced his left hand, a souvenir from the Argonne forest. Behind him, Captain James Wilson shifted uncomfortably, waiting to be acknowledged. The fort was silent save for the distant sound of a bugler practicing taps. An inappropriate choice, Wilson thought, given the circumstances. "Private Reynolds confirmed the identity," Wilson finally said when the silence became unbearable. "It was Frank Harmon, the man they call Rattler." Blackwood didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. The late afternoon sun caught the silver at his temples, illuminating his head like a tarnished halo. "Reynolds is certain." Blackwood's voice was soft-controlled, somehow more terrifying for its restraint. "Yes, sir. He recognized Harmon from the wanted posters. Said he's leading a gang called the Serpent Riders now. 6 of them, including a Mexican woman. And my son," Wilson swallowed. "Clean shot through the heart, sir. Reynolds says he didn't suffer." Blackwood's iron hand opened and closed once the mechanical fingers catching the light. "A mercy I won't extend to Harmon." He turned from the window and Wilson had to stop himself from taking a step back. The colonel's face was a mask carved from granite, but his eyes burned with something that made Wilson's skin crawl. "Have my son's body prepared for transport to Arlington," Blackwood said. "Full military honors." "Yes, sir, of course." Blackwood moved to his desk and unfolded a map of the territory. His iron fingers traced a line from Phantom Ridge to the south. "Reynolds says they headed southeast," Wilson offered. Blackwood shook his head. "That's what they want us to think. Harmon was my best tactical officer before he turned. He'll go east initially, then double back north." His iron finger tapped a spot on the map. Devil's Creek, abandoned mining territory. Difficult terrain for cavalry, but good sight lines for defense. Wilson marveled at the colonel's analytical precision, even in grief, or perhaps because of it. "Sir, with respect, we should notify the territorial authorities. Let the marshals handle—" "No." The word fell like an axe. "This is a military matter. Harmon was under my command. His betrayal is mine to address." Wilson knew better than to argue. "How do you want to proceed, sir?" Blackwood's face remained expressionless, but something shifted behind his eyes, something cold and methodical falling into place. "Contact Sergeant Major Donovan. Tell him I'm activating the Bloodhounds." Wilson felt his mouth go dry. "The Bloodhounds, sir, but they were disbanded after the armistice. Most of those men were sent home or committed to asylums. Donovan keeps track of his men." Blackwood's voice was matter-of-fact. "The ones who can still function anyway. Telegraph him immediately." "Yes, sir." Wilson hesitated. "And the official report on Lieutenant Blackwood's death?" Blackwood looked up, his gaze piercing. "Killed by bandits while transporting relief supplies to the Navajo reservation. A humanitarian mission." His lips twisted in something that wasn't quite a smile. Thomas always did have a soft heart, like his mother. The comparison seemed to pain him momentarily, a crack in the granite facade. Then it was gone. "You're dismissed, Captain." Wilson saluted and turned to leave, relief flooding through him. "One more thing, Wilson." He stopped, dread pooling in his stomach. "Sir, have the quartermaster prepare field rations for 20 men, 2 weeks' supply, and ammunition. No requisition forms, no records." "Sir, that's against—" "Do you have a problem with my orders, Captain?" Blackwood's voice was soft as a surgeon's knife. Wilson straightened. "No, sir. I'll see to it personally." After Wilson left, Blackwood returned to the window. The sun was setting now, painting the desert in blood-red light. In the distance, soldiers were lowering the flag, folding it with ceremonial precision. He opened a drawer and removed a silver flask, taking a long pull before returning it. Then he picked up a framed photograph from his desk, the same one Frank had found on Thomas's body. father and son at West Point. Blackwood set it face down on the desk, unable to look at it any longer. From another drawer, he withdrew a different photograph. Yellowed with age, its edges worn soft from handling. A woman with Thomas's eyes, her expression serious but kind. On the back, in the same precise handwriting, Eleanor, San Francisco, 1899. He stared at it for a long moment, then carefully returned it to the drawer. When he looked up again, the mask was back in place. He sat at his desk and began to write, his iron hand perfectly steady. Sergeant Major Donovan, the bloodhounds are needed once more. The quarry is Frank Rattler Harmon. You have my authorization to use any means necessary. No prisoners. Colonel Victor Blackwood. The abandoned mining town clung to the mountainside like a scab on wounded flesh. Once white buildings, now weathered gray, their windows dark and hollow. The only light came from a single lantern in what had once been the assay office, now serving as the Serpent Riders' temporary headquarters. Frank stood over a rough wooden table studying a map by lantern light. His shoulder had been bandaged where the bullet grazed him, but he barely noticed the pain. Other wounds ran deeper. Elena entered silently, a skill that had served her well as a spy during the war. She set a cup of coffee beside him, the cheap tin mug steaming in the cool night air. The men are asking what happens next. She said, her accent more pronounced when she was tired. They know we hit something bigger than a payroll transport. Frank took a sip of the bitter coffee. They're right. That officer, you knew him. No. Frank pushed the wallet across the table. But I knew his father. Elena examined the photograph, her expression careful. Blackwood, the colonel who ordered you to execute women and children, yes. Frank's voice was flat. And when I refused, he made sure I was court-martialed for insubordination, stripped of my rank, discharged without honor. And now you've killed his son. Elena set the wallet down gently as if it might explode. He will come for you, Frank, with everything he has. Frank nodded. I'm counting on it. She studied him, trying to read behind the mask he wore so well. This was never just about the money for Margaret, was it? You wanted to draw him out? The money for Margaret is real, Frank insisted. Pierce won't release her without it. But yes, I've been waiting for a reckoning with Blackwood. And now it has found you. Elena placed her hand over his. But not the way you planned. Frank closed his eyes briefly. No, not like this. The door burst open and Miles rushed in, breathless. Ryder coming in fast. Charlie's got him in his sights. Frank was on his feet instantly. Hold fire until I'm there. Outside, the night air was sharp with the scent of pine and dust. Charlie crouched behind a water trough. Thompson aimed at the approaching horseman. He's alone, Charlie reported. Riding hard. Frank drew his pistol and moved to the center of the empty street. Cover me. The rider emerged from the darkness, his horse lathered with sweat. He reined to a stop 20 yards from Frank, raising his hands slowly to show he was unarmed. Frank Harmon, the man called out. Who's asking? Name's Jenkins. I work for Maxwell Pierce. Frank's grip tightened on his pistol. You're a long way from Maxwell's bank, Jenkins. Mr. Pierce sent me to find you. Jenkins remained on his horse, hands still raised. Said to tell you he knows about the Army payroll. Says the price for your sister just went up. Cold fury washed through Frank. The deal was $50,000. That's what I have. Jenkins shrugged. Inflation's a bitch. New price is everything you took. Mr. Pierce says the Army's putting up a reward for you boys that's worth more than what he originally asked. Frank took a step forward. And if I refuse, then Miss Margaret gets sold to a cat house in Mexico. Jenkins delivered the threat casually. Mr. Pierce says she'll fetch a good price, being educated and all. In one fluid motion, Frank raised his pistol and fired. The bullet took Jenkins in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle. Before he hit the ground, Frank was on him, pistol pressed to his forehead. You tell Pierce, Frank growled, his voice barely human, that if he touches my sister, there won't be a hole deep enough for him to hide in. I'm coming with his money, original price, and he'd better pray she's unharmed. Jenkins nodded frantically, blood soaking his shirt. I'll tell him, Jesus Christ, I'm just the messenger. Frank stood holstering his pistol. Charlie, patch him up enough to ride, then send him back to Pierce. Charlie lowered the Thompson and came forward with the medical kit they'd taken from the convoy. Frank turned to find Elena watching him, her expression unreadable in the darkness. "You should have killed him," she said quietly. "Pierce will know we're at Devil's Creek now." "Pierce already knew," Frank replied. "He has spies everywhere, and I need him to get the message." He looked past her to the mountains rising like sentinels in the moonlight. "We move at first light. The rest of the men need to know what we're facing." Inside the assay office, Frank laid out the situation to his men. The stolen map was spread on the table, weighted down with ammunition clips at each corner. "We hit a bigger target than we intended." He began, looking each man in the eye. "The officer I killed was Lieutenant Thomas Blackwood, son of Colonel Victor Blackwood." A heavy silence fell over the room. Even Jack, usually quick with a joke, looked grim. "Jesus," Dwight muttered. "Iron Hand Blackwood from the Argonne." Frank nodded. "The same, and now he'll be coming for us. All of us." Miles, the youngest, looked confused. "So what, we've outrun Army patrols before?" "This won't be a standard patrol," Frank said. "Blackwood commanded the 112th Infantry during the war. They called them the Bloodhounds, specialized in hunting down German stragglers behind the lines." He paused. "They weren't known for taking prisoners." Charlie's face had gone pale. "I heard stories about the Bloodhounds in the field hospital. They'd hang men from trees, leave messages carved in their flesh for others to find. Blackwood will bring them out of retirement for this," Frank continued, "and they'll come with everything they have." Jack whistled low. "All this over one dead lieutenant, not just any lieutenant." Frank's voice hardened. "Blackwood's only son, only family." Understanding dawned on their faces. This wasn't just a pursuit anymore. It was a blood vendetta. Elena spoke from the shadows. "We should split up. Harder to track 5 trails than one." Frank shook his head. "That's what they'll expect. We stay together, but we change the game." He pointed to a spot on the map. "We head north into Navajo territory. Ground's too dry for tracking there, and the locals won't help the army." "What about your sister?" Miles asked. "Pierce is expecting payment." "We make a detour first." Frank traced a route with his finger. "There's a bank in Redemption. Small town, minimal security. We hit it and get the additional funds Pierce is demanding, then continue north to the meeting point." The men exchanged glances, weighing their options. They'd all known the risks when they joined Frank, but this was different. This was an enemy who wouldn't stop, wouldn't negotiate, wouldn't show mercy. "I understand if any of you want out," Frank said into the silence. "Take your share of what we've got and go your own way. No hard feelings." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Dwight spat tobacco juice onto the floor. "Ain't none of us got anywhere better to be, Rattler. We're with you." One by one, the others nodded their agreement. Even Miles, his young face set with determination. Frank felt the weight of their loyalty like a physical thing. These men and Elena had followed him into hell once already. Now he was asking them to go deeper. "Get some sleep," he told them. "We ride at dawn." Later, alone in what had once been the mine foreman's office, Frank sat cleaning his pistols by lamplight. The mechanical routine was soothing a ritual that required no thought, only muscle memory. A soft knock at the door interrupted his meditation. "Come in." Elena entered, carrying a bottle of whiskey and 2 chipped glasses. Without a word, she poured 2 fingers into each glass and handed one to Frank. "To fallen enemies," she said, raising her glass, "and the ghosts they become." Frank met her eyes over the rim of his glass as he drank. The whiskey burned a path down his throat, warming him from within. Elena set her glass down and moved behind him, her hands coming to rest on his shoulders. "You carry too much, Frank," she murmured, beginning to knead the tension from his muscles. "The war, your sister, and now this." He closed his eyes, allowing himself this moment of vulnerability. "Someone has to." Her fingers found the knot of scar tissue on his back, a parting gift from a German bayonet at Belleau Wood. "And who carries you when you fall?" He had no answer for that. She leaned down, her lips brushing his ear. "Let me help you forget. Just for tonight." Frank set his pistol aside and stood, turning to face her. In the lamplight, her eyes were dark pools, unreadable. She was beautiful in a dangerous way, like the desert itself, seductive and merciless. He traced the curve of her cheek with his thumb. "You're the only one I trust to watch my back, Elena." Something flickered across her face, regret, guilt. But it was gone before he could identify it, replaced by a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Then trust me now." she whispered, leading him to the narrow cot in the corner. Outside, a coyote howled at the moon, a lonely sound that echoed through the empty town. Above Devil's Creek, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the dramas playing out beneath them. And somewhere to the west, a colonel stood over his son's body, his heart turning to stone. The Blackwood Ranch house stood alone on a rise overlooking the desert, its adobe walls the color of bleached bone in the early morning light. Behind it, cattle pens stood empty, the animals long since sold off. The war had changed everything even here in this remote corner of the territory. In the barn that had once housed prize horses, 20 men stood at attention, despite their civilian clothes. They ranged in age from their late 20s to early 40s, but all shared the same hollow-eyed look of men who had seen too much and come back wrong. Sergeant Major Patrick Donovan paced before them, his posture military precise despite the 3 years since his official discharge. His face was a roadmap of scars, the most prominent, a purple furrow that ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth, courtesy of a German trench knife. "Some of you were surprised to get my telegram," he began, his voice carrying the lilt of his Boston Irish roots. "Thought your days of service were over. Thought you'd left the war behind." He stopped pacing, his gaze sweeping over them. "But war isn't something you leave behind, is it, boys? It follows you, lives in your dreams, waits for you in the dark." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the formation. "Colonel Blackwood has called us back for one final mission. A hunt." Donovan's scarred mouth twisted in a facsimile of a smile. "And hunting is what we do best." The barn door opened, and Colonel Blackwood entered. The men snapped to attention, old instincts resurfacing. Blackwood wore his full dress uniform, medals gleaming on his chest, iron hand polished to a mirror shine. "At ease," he said, though none of the men relaxed. "3 days ago, my son was murdered by Frank Harmon and his gang of deserters." His voice was controlled, emotionless. "Some of you served with Harmon. You know he was once a decorated officer. That makes his betrayal all the more personal." Blackwood moved to a table where a map was spread out. "Harmon's gang calls themselves the Serpent Riders. 6 of them, heavily armed, currently believed to be near Devil's Creek." He tapped the location with his iron finger. "We have reason to believe they're heading north into Navajo territory." One of the men, a lean, wolf-like individual with a perpetual twitch in his right eye, spoke up. "Permission to speak, sir." "Granted, Cooper. Why not let the territorial authorities handle this, or at least bring in regular army units?" Blackwood's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the barn seemed to drop. "Because this is personal, Cooper. Because what we're going to do to Harmon and his people falls outside the bounds of what the authorities would sanction." He looked around the barn, meeting each man's gaze. "What I'm asking isn't official. It isn't sanctioned. There will be no records, no commendations, no recognition. Just blood," Donovan added softly. "Just blood," Blackwood agreed. "Any man who has reservations can leave now. No questions asked, no repercussions." No one moved. "Good." Blackwood returned to the map. "We'll travel in groups of 4. Civilian clothes but military weapons. I want Harmon's people found captured if possible, killed if necessary." His iron hand closed into a fist. "Except for Harmon himself. He's mine." Donovan stepped forward. "You heard the colonel. Gear up. We move in 30 minutes. As the men dispersed to collect their equipment, Blackwood drew Donovan aside. "I want a clear message sent," he said quietly. "Anyone harboring Harmon or his people pays the price. I don't care if it's a whole town or a single shepherd. Make examples." Donovan nodded, no hint of hesitation in his scarred face. "Like we did in the Argonne." "Exactly like that." Blackwood looked past him to the rising sun turning the desert gold. Harmon thought he could hide from his past, show him how wrong he was. In the distance, dust rose from the approaching convoy of trucks that would carry the bloodhounds to the hunting grounds. The machines looked alien against the ancient landscape, metal monsters invading a primeval world. Blackwood watched them come, his face impassive, his iron hand opening and closing rhythmically at his side. In his pocket, he carried the photograph of his wife and son, though he hadn't looked at it since identifying Thomas's body. Some wounds were too fresh to touch. Some could only be healed with blood. The serpent riders moved through the landscape like shadows, keeping to the arroyos and dry creek beds where their passage would leave minimal sign. Frank rode point, scanning the horizon through his binoculars every few minutes. Behind him, the others maintained spacing of 50 yards between riders, close enough to signal far enough apart that a single ambush couldn't take them all. They left the Indian motorcycle behind, buried in a shallow grave of sand. Too noisy, too distinctive. The horses were slower but surer in this terrain. Elena rode up beside Frank, her mare stepping lightly over the rocky ground. "Dust cloud to the west," she reported. "Moving fast. Vehicles, not riders." Frank raised his binoculars, focusing on the distant smudge on the horizon. "Army trucks. 4 of them." His jaw tightened. Blackwood didn't waste any time. "They're heading for Devil's Creek," Elena observed. "They don't know we've gone yet." "They will soon enough." Frank lowered the binoculars and signaled to the others to increase pace. "We need to make the Box Canyon by nightfall. It's defensible if they catch up." They rode in silence for another hour, the sun climbing higher, baking the earth beneath them. Miles's horse began to falter. Its breathing labored in the thinning mountain air. "We need to rest them," Dwight called from the rear. "Push these animals too hard and we'll be walking." Frank nodded reluctantly. "There's a spring half a mile east. We'll water them there, then push on." The spring was little more than a trickle emerging from a crack in the rocks, but it was enough. While the horses drank, the men refilled canteens and checked their weapons. The routine was familiar, comforting in its predictability. Charlie approached Frank, his eyes shadowed beneath his hat brim. "Rattler, I've been thinking. Maybe Elena's right. Maybe we should split up after all." Frank looked at him sharply. "Why the change of heart?" Charlie glanced over his shoulder, ensuring they weren't overheard. "Because I know what Blackwood's bloodhounds can do. I was at Montfaucon when they brought in those German officers they'd captured. What was left of them anyway." He swallowed hard. "If they catch us all together—" "They won't catch us," Frank said with more confidence than he felt. "And if they do, we're stronger together." "Maybe." Charlie didn't sound convinced. "But if one of us gets to Pierce, Margaret has a chance. If we all go down together—" Frank clapped him on the shoulder. "We're not going down, old friend. Not today." But as they remounted and continued north, Frank found his eyes drawn repeatedly to the western horizon, searching for dust clouds. The weight of command had never felt heavier. These men trusted him with their lives, just as soldiers had trusted him in France. And he had failed those soldiers at Heidelheim, unable to protect them from Blackwood's orders. He would not fail again. By mid-afternoon, they reached the approach to Box Canyon. Frank halted the column, studying the narrow entrance with professional scrutiny. Good sightlines, limited approaches, easily defended by a small force. "Charlie, take Miles and scout ahead," he ordered. "Make sure we're not riding into a trap." As the 2 men rode forward, Frank dismounted, stretching his legs. The wound on his shoulder had begun to throb again, a dull counterpoint to the headache building behind his eyes. Elena appeared at his side, offering her canteen. "You look like hell," she said bluntly. Frank took a long drink. "Feel worse." Her eyes searched his face. "Second thoughts." "No." He handed back the canteen. "But I'm worried about Margaret. If Pierce gets spooked by the army hunt—" "He won't harm her," Elena said with certainty. "She's too valuable as leverage." Frank wasn't so sure. Maxwell Pierce hadn't built his banking empire by being predictable. The man collected debts in money or blood, with no preference between the two. "We need to move faster," he decided. "Once we're through the canyon, we'll ride through the night. Hit Redemption at dawn, then straight to the rendezvous with Pierce." Elena nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "And Blackwood—" "Let him chase ghosts." Frank's hand drifted to the wallet in his pocket, Thomas Blackwood's wallet. He hadn't been able to discard it, though he couldn't have explained why. "We'll be gone before he picks up our trail." Charlie and Miles returned their expressions grim. "Canyon's clear," Charlie reported, "but there's something you need to see on the other side." The something turned out to be the remains of a Navajo shepherd. The man had been hung from a juniper tree overlooking the canyon exit, his body twisting slowly in the afternoon breeze. Around his neck hung a wooden sign, the words carved deep into the grain. Harboring serpents, Frank dismounted and approached the body. The man's face was frozen in a rictus of pain, eyes bulging, tongue protruding. He hadn't died quickly. "Bloodhounds," Charlie whispered, crossing himself. They're ahead of us. Frank studied the ground around the tree. Multiple boot prints, cigarette butts. They'd taken their time with this. How? Jack demanded. We've been moving fast, staying off the main trails. Someone talked, Dwight said, his voice hard. Someone in Devil's Creek must have seen which way we headed. Or someone closer, Frank thought, though he kept it to himself. He turned to his men, seeing the fear beginning to take hold. Change of plans, he announced. We can't go north now. We'll head east toward the territorial border. That's open country, Miles protested. No cover for miles. Exactly. They'll expect us to stay in the mountains where we can hide. We'll do the opposite. Frank checked his pocket watch. 3 hours until sunset. We ride hard until dark, then make camp in the flatlands. No fire, no lights. As they remounted, Frank found himself looking at the dead shepherd again. The man had probably known nothing about the serpent riders. Wrong place, wrong time. An example. That night, camped in a shallow depression, miles from the nearest cover, Frank stood first watch. The stars overhead seemed cold and distant, offering no comfort. The moon just past full cast enough light to see by making him feel exposed, vulnerable. Elena joined him, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders against the desert chill. You should sleep, he told her. Long ride tomorrow. She ignored the suggestion. The men are scared, Frank. That shepherd shook them. Good. Fear keeps you sharp. Fear makes you stupid, she countered. Makes you take risks, make mistakes. Frank couldn't argue with that. He'd seen it often enough in the trenches. What would you have me do, he asked. Turn myself in. Let Blackwood have his revenge. Maybe that's the only way this ends. Her voice was soft, almost lost in the night breeze. 1 life for 5. Frank shook his head. Blackwood won't stop with me. Not anymore. He'll hunt all of us to the ends of the earth. He looked at her, moonlight silvering her dark hair. You know what men like him are like. They don't forgive. They don't forget. Elena was silent for a long moment. Then we need a plan. A real one, not just running until we drop. I'm working on it. Frank's hand went to his pocket, fingering the edge of Thomas Blackwood's wallet. An idea had been forming in his mind, something desperate and dangerous. Something that might just work. Get some sleep, he told her again. I'll wake you for second watch. After she left, Frank took out the wallet and studied the photograph again. Thomas and Victor Blackwood at West Point. Father and son bound by blood and duty. Now one dead, the other consumed by vengeance. Frank tucked the wallet away and looked out at the vast moonlit desert. Somewhere out there the bloodhounds were hunting, drawing closer with every hour. The game had changed. It was no longer about escaping with the payroll, rescuing Margaret, starting fresh somewhere far away. Now it was about survival, raw and primal. Frank checked his pistol, feeling the reassuring weight of it in his hand. If Blackwood wanted a war, he'd give him one. But wars had casualties, and Frank had a sinking feeling that before this was over, he'd be losing people he cared about. Again. The desert offered no answers, only silence and starlight. Frank settled in for his watch alone, with the ghosts of his past and the shadows of what was to come. Blood ran black in the moonlight. Sergeant Major Patrick Donovan wiped his knife clean on the dead man's shirt, his scarred face impassive. Around him, the small trading post burned flames, clawing at the night sky. 3 bodies lay sprawled in the dirt, the owner and his 2 sons. Their only crime, selling supplies to a group of riders matching the Serpent Rider's description. Cooper approached, rifle slung over his shoulder. No sign of Harmon or his people. Place was clean. Donovan nodded, sheathing his knife. They were here, though. Cigarette butts behind the store. Same brand Harmon's man Charlie smokes. We're still a day behind them. Cooper's eye twitched, a nervous tick that had followed him home from France. Colonel won't be pleased. Colonel wants a message sent. Donovan gestured to the burning building, the bodies arranged in a neat row. This is the message. From the shadows, Colonel Blackwood emerged, his uniform replaced by civilian riding clothes, though his bearing remained unmistakably military. The iron hand gleamed dully in the firelight. String them up, he ordered, his voice carrying no emotion. Leave the sign. Cooper hesitated. Sir, the oldest one's just a boy. 17, maybe 18. Blackwood's eyes shifted to Cooper, cold as gunmetal. Did I stutter, Cooper? No, sir. Cooper swallowed, then signaled to two other men. Together, they began dragging the bodies toward a nearby cottonwood tree. Blackwood turned to Donovan. What's our next move? Donovan unfolded a map, holding it so the firelight illuminated the worn paper. Harmon's been zigzagging, east then, north, then east again, trying to throw us off. His finger traced the meandering route. But he's got limited options. Needs to resupply, needs fresh horses soon. The finger stopped at a small dot on the map. Redemption. Backwater town, but it's got a bank. If he's still planning to pay off Pierce for his sister, that's where he'll go. Blackwood studied the map, his iron fingers tapping a slow rhythm against his thigh. How far? Day's hard ride. Less in the trucks. Take Cooper and Jackson in one of the trucks. Scout ahead. Don't engage unless you have a clear advantage. I want Harmon captured, not killed. Blackwood's eyes reflected the flame's two burning points in his otherwise expressionless face. The rest of us will follow with the main force. Donovan folded the map. What about the locals? People in Redemption might not take kindly to our methods. Then they shouldn't get in our way. Blackwood turned back toward the fire. Remember the Argonne Patrick? How we found those German officers who'd been executing our wounded? I remember. What did we do to them? Donovan's scarred mouth twisted in what might have been a smile. Made examples. Exactly. Numb. Blackwood looked at the three bodies now hanging from the cottonwood, the wooden sign around the middle one's neck catching the firelight. Serpent sympathizers. Sometimes terror is the most efficient weapon. As Blackwood walked away, Donovan remained by the fire watching the trading post collapse in on itself, sparks spiraling upward like lost souls. He'd followed Blackwood through the hell of the Western Front, through mud and blood and poison gas. Had seen him lose his hand at the Argonne, had seen him keep fighting with the stump still smoking. But this was different. This was personal in a way the war had never been. And personal made men unpredictable. Even men like Victor Blackwood. Donovan touched the scar that bisected his face, feeling the familiar ridge of tissue. War had marked them all. Some marks just showed more than others. Behind him, the cottonwood tree creaked under its grim burden, and somewhere in the darkness, a coyote began to howl. Frank jolted awake, hand already on his pistol. Beside him, Elena slept on her face, peaceful in the gray light of dawn. He dreamt of Heidelheim again, the village in Germany, where everything had changed. Women and children lined up against a stone wall. Blackwood's cold order. The look in his men's eyes when Frank had ordered them to lower their weapons. Some nights he still heard the gunshots that had followed his court-martial. Still wondered if he could have done more than just refuse the order himself. He eased out of the bedroll, careful not to wake Elena. Outside their small tent, the camp was stirring. Charlie stood watch Thompson, cradled in his arms, eyes scanning the horizon. Dwight was already brewing coffee over a small smokeless fire dug into the earth. Jack and Miles were checking the horses, speaking in low murmurs. How far to Redemption? Frank asked, accepting a tin cup of coffee from Dwight. 10-15 miles. We could make it by mid-morning if we push. Frank sipped the bitter brew, considering. They'd been riding hard for days, staying off main trails, crossing their own tracks to confuse pursuers. The horses were near exhaustion. The men weren't much better. We rest here until noon, he decided. Enter town in the afternoon when the bank will be full, less chance of an alarm being raised. Dwight nodded his agreement. Smart. Gives us time to scout the approach, too. Have Charlie and Miles do that. You and Jack rest. Frank drained his cup. I'll take over watch. Charlie approached, his face drawn with fatigue. Rider coming in from the east. Single horseman moving slow. Frank drew his pistol. Wake Elena. Everyone in position. The camp erupted into controlled activity. Elena emerged from the tent, rifle in hand, taking position behind a cluster of rocks. Jack and Miles spread out, creating a perimeter. Dwight doused the fire with sand. Frank raised his binoculars, focusing on the distant figure. An old man on a mule moving at the unhurried pace of someone with nowhere particular to be. Hold positions, Frank ordered. Might just be a prospector. The old man drew closer, apparently unaware of the armed reception awaiting him. His mule plodded along, head bobbing with each step. The rider wore a battered slouch hat and a beard that reached his chest. When he was 50 yards out, Frank stepped into view, pistol held at his side but visible. That's far enough, old-timer. The old man reined his mule to a stop, squinting at Frank. Well now, he said in a voice like dry leaves rustling, ain't you the jumpy sort? These are jumpy times, Frank replied. What's your business here? Just passing through, heading to Redemption for supplies. The old man hawked and spat in the dust. Name's Ezekiel. Most folks call me Zeke. You always travel this early, Zeke, the old man chuckled. At my age, sleep's a luxury. Figure I might as well be moving if I'm awake. He peered past Frank toward the camp. You boys look like you've been riding hard. Army after you. Frank's grip tightened on his pistol. What makes you say that? 'Cause they're after everybody these days. Zeke shrugged. Especially folks that look like they might have been in the war. Army's rounding up deserters all over the territory. Or so they say. Frank studied the old man looking for signs of deception. Found none. You know Redemption well. Like the back of my hand. Been prospecting these parts for 30 years. An idea formed in Frank's mind. How'd you like to earn $50? Zeke's roomy eyes widened. For doing what exactly? Information and a bit of scouting. Frank holstered his pistol. Charlie Miles, stand down. Rest of you too. The serpent riders emerged from their positions, weapons lowered, but not put away. Zeke took them in with obvious interest. Well, now ain't this a gathering, he observed. You boys playing at war or running from it? Little of both, Frank admitted. What can you tell us about Redemption, the bank in particular? Zeke dismounted, his joints popping audibly. First National small operation. One guard usually half asleep. Manager's a fella named Henderson. Keeps a shotgun under the counter. He accepted a cup of coffee from Dwight. Town's been quiet lately. Too quiet if you ask me. What do you mean? Elena asked, joining them. Folks are scared. There's been killings. Zeke blew on his coffee. Trading post up north was burnt to the ground 3 nights ago. Family strung up. People are saying it was the army, but not official-like. Men in civilian clothes with military weapons. Frank and Charlie exchanged glances. The bloodhounds were closer than they'd thought. These men, Frank pressed. Any description? One's got a face like a jigsaw puzzle, missing half his ear too. Zeke tapped his own ear for emphasis. Another's tall, built like a bull. They rode in yesterday asking questions about strangers passing through. Donovan and Cooper, Frank thought. Blackwood's top lieutenants. How many men with them? Just the 2 that I heard about, but there's talk of more camped outside town. Zeke studied Frank over the rim of his cup. You're him, ain't you? The one they're calling Rattler. The one they're hunting. Frank didn't answer, but his expression must have confirmed it. Zeke nodded to himself. Thought so? Heard stories about you. Standing up to that butcher Blackwood during the war. He spat again. My boy came back from France missing an arm. Said Blackwood would have left him to die if a nurse hadn't found him. Said Blackwood didn't believe in wasting resources on the wounded. That sounds like him, Frank agreed quietly. So what's your plan? Ride into Redemption with Blackwood's hounds waiting for you. We need that bank. Frank's voice hardened. My sister's life depends on it. Zeke scratched his beard thoughtfully. Might be another way. Henderson keeps the real money in a safe at his house. Bank's just for show these days. Too many robberies. Frank's interest sharpened. Where's the house? Edge of town, white picket fence, blue shutters, can't miss it. Zeke drained his coffee. But you won't get near it with Blackwood's men watching the roads. That's where you come in, Frank said. $50 to ride into town ahead of us. Find out exactly where Donovan and Cooper are staying, how many men they have, and when Henderson's likely to be away from his house. Zeke considered the offer. Make it 100, and I want something else. Name it. When you find Blackwood, I want to know where he's buried. The old man's eyes had turned hard as flint. Want to piss on his grave for what he did to my boy? Frank nodded once. Deal. They spent the morning planning using a rough map of Redemption that Zeke sketched in the dirt. The old prospector left before noon, his mule ambling toward town with the unhurried gait that had served as his cover for decades of survival in the territory. Can we trust him? Elena asked, watching Zeke disappear over a rise. He has no reason to betray us, Frank said, and every reason to hate Blackwood. Hatred makes men unpredictable. Frank couldn't argue with that. He'd seen it in the trenches, the way hatred could turn otherwise rational men into reckless killers or paralyze them with fear. It's a risk we have to take, he said finally. We need that money for Margaret. Elena touched his arm, her fingers lingering. And after, when your sister is safe, what then, Frank? He had no answer. Since his discharge, he'd lived day to day focused only on the next objective. First surviving, then finding men he could trust, then planning Margaret's rescue. He'd never allowed himself to think beyond that. One step at a time, he said, moving away from her touch. Let's get through today first. They broke camp at mid-afternoon, approaching Redemption from the south, where the terrain offered more cover. The town appeared on the horizon, a collection of wooden buildings, shimmering in the heat haze, the church steeple rising above the rest, like an accusing finger pointed at heaven. Frank signaled a halt while they were still a mile out. Charlie, you and Miles circle west. Find Henderson's house. Elena and I will head for the livery stable where we're supposed to meet Zeke. Dwight, Jack, find positions on the outskirts. If things go bad, we'll need covering fire for the retreat. The men nodded, faces grim but determined. They'd been through enough together to know the drill. What about the payroll? Jack asked. We leaving it buried here? Frank shook his head. Too risky. Divide it up. Each man carries a share. If we get separated, head for the rendezvous point with Pierce. They split the money, mostly bearer bonds and certificates, with some gold coins and currency. Not enough for comfort, but enough to make each of them a target. As they prepared to separate, Frank pulled Charlie aside. If anything happens to me, you get to Pierce. Pay whatever he asks for Margaret. Charlie's eyes widened. Nothing's going to happen to you, boss. Just in case. Frank pressed Thomas Blackwood's wallet into Charlie's hand. And give him this. Tell him it belonged to Blackwood's son. He'll understand the message. Charlie tucked the wallet into his shirt pocket, a troubled look crossing his face. What aren't you telling us, Frank? Frank clapped him on the shoulder. Just covering all possibilities. Now go. We meet back here at midnight. The sun was low on the horizon as Frank and Elena rode into Redemption, their horses walking casually as if they had all the time in the world. They'd changed clothes, Frank in a shopkeeper's suit salvaged from an abandoned homestead, Elena in a modest dress that transformed her from guerrilla fighter to respectable wife. The town was quiet, only a few people visible on the main street. Most of the storefronts were shuttered despite the early hour. Fear had emptied the town more effectively than any official curfew. They tied their horses outside the livery stable and entered the familiar smell of hay and horse sweat, a momentary comfort. The stable boy, no more than 12, eyed them warily. Looking for Zeke, Frank said, flipping the boy a coin. Old-timer with a mule. Said he'd meet us here. The boy caught the coin and pocketed it in one smooth motion. Back stall, he said, jerking his thumb toward the rear of the stable. Been waiting for you, folks. Zeke sat on a hay bale, whittling a piece of wood with a pocket knife that looked as ancient as he was. He glanced up as they approached, then returned to his carving. Took your time, he muttered. What's the situation? Frank asked, keeping his voice low. Bad. Donovan and Cooper are at the hotel. Got 4 more men with them. Military types trying to look civilian and failing. Zeke set aside his whittling. But that ain't the worst of it. Rest of their outfits camped 2 miles north of town. 15, maybe 20 men. And word is, Blackwood himself is with them. Frank felt his blood run cold. You're certain as hearsay gets. Fella at the saloon was talking about a colonel with an iron hand. Zeke spat on the stable floor. Not many of those walking around. Elena's hand found Frank's arm, squeezing in warning, or reassurance, he couldn't tell which. What about Henderson, she asked. That's your one piece of luck. He's at a poker game at the saloon. Happens every Thursday. Won't be home until late. Zeke stood joints, creaking. His wife's visiting her sister in Alamogordo. House is empty except for a housekeeper who's deaf as a post. Frank considered their options. The bank job was out too risky with Donovan's men in town. But Henderson's house might still be viable. Show us the house, he decided. We'll handle it from there. Zeke led them through back alleys, avoiding the main street where Donovan's men might be watching. Redemption's respectable district consisted of a few blocks of well-maintained houses, a stark contrast to the ramshackle structures that made up the rest of the town. Henderson's house stood on a corner lot exactly as Zeke had described it. White picket fence, blue shutters, a neat garden where a stooped old woman was deadheading roses despite the fading light. "That's the housekeeper," Zeke whispered. "Mrs. Abernathy, stone deaf like I said, but sharp as a tack otherwise." Frank studied the house, noting entrances, windows, possible escape routes. "Where's the safe likely to be?" "Study probably. Back of the house away from the street." "Any dogs?" Zeke shook his head. "Henderson's afraid of 'em. Won't have one on the property." Frank nodded, decision made. "You've done your part, Zeke. Get yourself clear of town before this goes down." The old man hesitated. "You sure you don't need another set of eyes? I may be old, but I can still shoot straight." "I'm sure. You've taken enough risk already." Frank pressed several gold coins into Zeke's palm. "For your trouble, and for your boy." Zeke's rheumy eyes glistened momentarily. He pocketed the coins without counting them. "Good luck, Rattler. Hope you find your sister." After Zeke left, Frank and Elena circled the block, approaching Henderson's house from the rear. The sun had set, darkness gathering in the corners of the yard. The housekeeper had gone inside, a single lamp burning in what appeared to be the kitchen. "Wait here," Frank told Elena. "Keep watch. If you see anything Donovan Cooper, any sign of trouble fire once in the air, then get to the horses." "And leave you?" Elena's eyes flashed. "I don't think so. That's an order." "I don't take orders from you, Frank. Never have." She checked her pistol, a small .38 hidden in the folds of her dress. "We go in together or not at all." Frank wanted to argue, but time was against them. "Fine, but I take the lead." They slipped through the back gate, keeping to the shadows. The kitchen door was locked, but the window beside it was unlatched. Frank eased it open and helped Elena through, then followed. The kitchen was warm, smelling of baked bread and coffee. A pot bubbled on the stove unattended. From somewhere deeper in the house came the faint sound of humming Mrs. Abernathy, presumably going about her evening routine. Frank drew his pistol, holding it low against his leg. They moved silently through the kitchen into a dining room, then a hallway lined with closed doors. At the far end, light spilled from beneath one door. The humming was louder here. Frank tried each door until he found what had to be Henderson's study, a masculine space of leather-bound books and hunting trophies. A large desk dominated one wall. Behind it, a painting of a mountain landscape hung slightly askew. "Oldest trick in the book," Elena murmured as Frank moved the painting aside to reveal a wall safe. Frank pressed his ear to the safe fingers, working the dial with the precision of a safecracker. It wasn't his first such job. The army had taught him many skills, and his time as an outlaw had refined them. The safe opened with a soft click. Inside, neatly stacked bundles of cash and several velvet pouches that clinked with the unmistakable sound of gold coins. "That's more than we need," Elena observed as Frank began emptying the safe. "Henderson's been skimming from his depositors," Frank replied, recognizing the bank's official currency straps. "We're just redistributing the wealth." A floorboard creaked in the hallway outside. Frank froze, pistol coming up. Elena moved to the side of the door, her own weapon ready. The door swung open. Mrs. Abernathy stood there, a shotgun leveled at Frank's chest. Her face was as wrinkled as a dried apple, but her hands were rock steady on the weapon. "Don't you move, young man," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "I may be deaf, but I ain't blind, and I sure as hell ain't stupid." Frank slowly raised his hands, pistol dangling from one finger. "Ma'am, we don't want any trouble." "Should have thought of that before you broke into Mr. Henderson's house." Her eyes darted to Elena. "Both of you out in the hall. Now!" They complied, moving into the hallway with measured steps. Frank's mind raced, calculating angles, distances, risks. The old woman kept the shotgun trained on him, seemingly unconcerned about Elena. It was a fatal mistake. Elena moved with the speed of a striking snake, knocking the shotgun barrel upward with one hand, while driving her pistol into the old woman's ribs with the other. "Drop it," she hissed, "or I drop you." Mrs. Abernathy's face contorted with fury, but she released the shotgun. Frank caught it before it hit the floor. "Tie her up," he told Elena. "Gently. She's just doing her job." They used curtain cords to bind the housekeeper to a chair in the kitchen, gagging her with a dish towel. Frank left a gold coin on the table beside her. "For your trouble, ma'am," he said, though he knew she couldn't hear him. "Henderson's been stealing from his own bank. Consider this justice." They finished emptying the safe stuffing, the money and valuables, into a pillowcase taken from a linen closet. By Frank's estimate, they had close to $30,000, more than enough to pay Pierce and have something left over for a fresh start. They were preparing to leave through the back door when a sound stopped them. Cold horses in the front yard, men's voices. Through the window, Frank caught a glimpse of Cooper's distinctive silhouette in the moonlight. "Back door's out," he whispered to Elena. "We'll have to go through the cellar." They found the cellar door off the kitchen. The steps creaked alarmingly as they descended into the musty darkness. Above them, the front door opened, boots stomping on the wooden floor. "Henderson!" Cooper's voice called out. "You home!" Frank and Elena moved through the cellar by feel, bumping into preserved food stores and old furniture. At the far end, Frank found what he was looking for, a coal chute, its small door secured by a rusted latch. "It'll be tight," he warned Elena as he worked the latch free. "I'll manage." The chute opened to the side yard, partially concealed by overgrown shrubs. Frank went first, squeezing through the narrow opening, the pillowcase of money clutched to his chest. Elena followed, her slender frame having an easier time of it. They crouched in the shadows, listening. Shouts from inside the house indicated Cooper's men had found Mrs. Abernathy. It wouldn't take them long to figure out what had happened. "Run for the livery," Frank whispered. "Don't stop for anything." They sprinted across the yard, keeping low. They'd almost reached the gate when a shout went up from the house. "There in the yard!" A gunshot split the night. Splinters exploded from the fence post beside Frank's head. He returned fire blindly, providing cover as Elena slipped through the gate. More shots followed them as they ran down the alley, zigzagging to present difficult targets in the darkness. Behind them, men poured from Henderson's house, Cooper's voice rising above the others, issuing commands. The livery stable loomed ahead, a darker shadow against the night sky. Their horses were still tethered outside, shifting nervously at the sound of gunfire. "Mount up!" Frank shouted, abandoning stealth. He tossed the pillowcase to Elena, who secured it to her saddle while he provided covering fire. They galloped out of town, bullets whining past them. Frank led them east initially, then cut north once they were beyond the town limits, hoping to circle around and reconnect with the others at the rendezvous point. The sound of pursuit grew behind them, not just Cooper's men from town, but others joining from the north. The Bloodhounds' main force alerted by the gunfire. "They're trying to cut us off," Elena called, her voice nearly lost in the thunder of hooves. Frank glanced back. Moonlight revealed at least a dozen riders spreading out in a flanking maneuver. Among them, a figure rode taller than the rest, his posture military straight despite the rough terrain. Blackwood. Frank's blood ran cold. This was no longer just a pursuit. It was becoming an encirclement. "We need to split up," he shouted to Elena. "You take the money, head for the rendezvous. I'll draw them off." "No!" Elena pulled her horse alongside his. "They'll kill you. That's the point. Blackwood wants me, not the money. Not you." Frank reached across and gripped her arm. "Margaret's life depends on that money getting to Pierce. You know the meeting place." Elena's face was a pale oval in the moonlight, her expression unreadable. "Frank, go!" He slapped her horse's flank, sending it surging ahead. Then he reined his own mount around, facing the oncoming riders. For a moment he thought Elena would disobey, would turn back for him. But she kept riding, disappearing into the darkness, the pillowcase of money secure on her saddle. Frank drew both pistols, a cold calm settling over him. If this was his last stand, he'd make it count. He emptied both guns into the approaching riders, dropping two from their saddles before spurring his horse perpendicular to their line of advance. The maneuver caught them by surprise, creating momentary confusion in their ranks. Frank used the opportunity to gallop for a rocky outcropping he'd noted earlier, a defensible position where one man might hold off many, at least for a while. Bullets kicked up dust around him as he rode his horse, laboring up the slope. One shot grazed his thigh, another tore through his sleeve. But he made it to the rocks, dismounting and sending his horse on with a slap to its rump. The pursuing riders split, some following the horse, others dismounting to approach the outcropping on foot. Among the latter, Frank spotted Blackwood, his iron hand catching the moonlight as he issued orders. Frank reloaded his pistols with his last ammunition, then settled in behind a boulder. The enemy had the numbers, but he had the high ground, the advantage of a fixed position. It would be a costly assault for them. The first wave came up the slope in a disorganized rush, 3 men firing as they advanced. Frank picked off 2 before they reached the halfway point. The third took cover behind a stunted pine tree. "You're surrounded, Harmon," Donovan's voice carried from below. "Surrender and the colonel will give you a fair trial." Frank almost laughed at that. Like the trial he gave those German civilians at Heidelheim. A moment of silence followed. Then Blackwood's voice, colder than the grave. "You speak of things you don't understand, Lieutenant. Heidelheim was a military necessity." "They were women and children," Frank called back. "Unarmed, terrified. They were harboring snipers, enemies of the United States." Blackwood's voice remained eerily calm. "Just as you're an enemy now, a traitor to your uniform. I kept my oath, to defend against all enemies, foreign and domestic." Frank shifted position, trying to keep an eye on all approaches. "You were the one who betrayed everything that uniform stands for." More men were moving up the slope now, using the darkness and the terrain for cover. Frank counted at least 8 with more waiting below. His ammunition wouldn't last against those numbers. A shot rang out from his left, a position he'd thought secure. Pain exploded in his side as the bullet found its mark. Frank fired back by instinct, heard a grunt as his shot connected. Warm blood soaked his shirt. Not immediately fatal, but he was running out of time, out of options. Then from the darkness to the west, a new sound emerged, the distinctive rattle of Charlie's Thompson submachine gun. Muzzle flashes lit up the night as Charlie, Miles, and Jack opened fire on Blackwood's men from their position on the ridge. Caught in the crossfire, the bloodhounds scattered seeking cover. Frank used the distraction to make his move, half running, half sliding down the backside of the outcropping, where Dwight waited with a spare horse. "Cutting it close, boss," Dwight said, helping Frank into the saddle. "Better late than never." Frank pressed a hand to his bleeding side. "The others, providing covering fire, they'll catch up." Dwight mounted his own horse, Elena, headed for the rendezvous with the money. Frank's vision swam as blood loss and exhaustion caught up with him. "We need to move. Now." They rode hard through the night, the sounds of gunfire gradually fading behind them. One by one, the other serpent riders caught up, materializing out of the darkness like ghosts. "Cooper's dead," Charlie reported, his face streaked with gunpowder. "Took a full burst from the Thompson." Frank nodded, too weak to speak. The wound in his side had bled through his makeshift bandage, the pain a constant throbbing presence. Miles rode close, concern evident even in the darkness. "You don't look good, Rattler." "I'll make it," Frank managed, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. "Need to reach the rendezvous." Dawn found them deep in Navajo territory, the red rock formations of the sacred lands rising around them like the bones of ancient beasts. They'd lost their pursuers hours ago, or so they hoped. But none of them believed for a moment that Blackwood would give up, not after Cooper. They made camp in a sheltered canyon, a small stream providing water for the exhausted horses. Charlie tended to Frank's wound, cleaning it with whiskey, packing it with sulfur powder, binding it tight with strips of clean cloth. "Bullet went through clean," he said, his voice betraying more confidence than his eyes. "Missed anything vital, looks like, but you've lost a lot of blood." Frank lay back against his saddle, too weak to even thank him. The world had narrowed to a tunnel of pain and fatigue, darkness creeping in at the edges of his vision. "Rest now," Charlie said, placing a canteen within reach. "We'll keep watch." Frank drifted in and out of consciousness, fever taking hold as infection set in despite Charlie's care. In his delirium, he saw Heidelheim, again the village square, the lined-up civilians, Blackwood's cold order. But this time the faces of the German women and children shifted, became Elena, Charlie, Miles, Dwight, Jack, became Margaret. And it was Thomas Blackwood giving the order to fire while his father watched with approval. He woke gasping, the sun high overhead. Jack sat nearby, whittling a stick with his hunting knife, eyes constantly scanning the horizon. "What time is it?" Frank asked, his voice a dry rasp. Jack started, then recovered. Past noon? You've been out for hours. He offered a canteen. Fever broke about an hour ago. Charlie said that was a good sign. Frank drank deeply the water, a blessed relief. The others, Charlie and Miles are scouting. Dwight's hunting. Jack resumed his whittling. No sign of pursuit since dawn. Frank pushed himself to a sitting position, ignoring the protest from his wounded side. We need to move. The rendezvous with Elena is tomorrow at sunset. You're in no shape to ride, Jack objected. Another day's rest. We don't have another day. Frank's voice hardened. Margaret doesn't have another day. Jack knew better than to argue. He helped Frank to his feet, steadying him when his legs threatened to buckle. By the time Charlie and Miles returned, Frank was packed and ready, his face gray with pain, but his eyes clear. They reported no sign of Blackwood's men, but fresh tracks suggesting a large group had passed through the area during the night. They're casting a wide net, Charlie concluded, trying to cut off all routes to the border. Then we don't head for the border, Frank decided. We go deeper into Navajo land. Follow the old trails south, then cut east to the rendezvous. Miles looked dubious. The Navajo aren't exactly friendly to whites these days. They have reason not to be, Frank acknowledged, but they hate the army more than they hate us. And I saved a Navajo scout during the war. Man named Thunder Sky. If he's still alive, he might remember the debt. It was a slim hope, but the only one they had. When Dwight returned with a brace of rabbits, they cooked a quick meal, then broke camp, heading south into increasingly rugged terrain. The day passed in a haze of pain for Frank. Each hoofbeat sent a fresh wave of agony through his side, but he endured in silence, focused on the objective. Find Elena. Get the money to Pierce. Save Margaret. Everything else was secondary. They made camp that night in a narrow ravine. No fire, cold rations only. The stars overhead seemed distant and cold, offering no comfort. Frank sat apart from the others, cleaning his pistols more by feel than sight in the darkness. Charlie joined him, offering a cigarette. Frank accepted the familiar ritual of smoking, a momentary distraction from the pain. Something's been bothering me, Charlie said after a while. Elena, why'd you send her alone with all that money? Frank exhaled smoke, considering his answer. She's the fastest rider, and Blackwood's men were after me, not her. Still, that's a lot of trust to put in someone. I trust all of you with my life, Frank replied evenly. Every day. Charlie was silent for a moment. There's trust, and then there's $30,000. Temptation like that. He let the thought hang unfinished. Elena will be at the rendezvous, Frank said with more confidence than he felt. With the money, for Margaret. Charlie nodded, but his expression remained troubled. He returned to the others, leaving Frank alone with his thoughts and the distant stars. Frank's hand went to his pocket, reaching for Thomas Blackwood's wallet before remembering he'd given it to Charlie for safekeeping. The wallet had become a talisman of sorts, a tangible connection to the man whose death had set all this in motion, and to the father who wouldn't rest until he had vengeance. Frank had never hated Blackwood, even after Heidelheim, after the court-martial, after everything. Hatred required energy he couldn't spare. But now, with Margaret's life hanging in the balance, with his men hunted like animals, he felt something cold and implacable growing within him. Not hatred. Something deeper. A reckoning postponed, but inevitable. The night deepened around him, the only sounds the soft nickering of the horses and the whispered conversation of his men. Somewhere out there, Blackwood was hunting, his iron will matched by his iron hand. And somewhere else, Elena rode with their future, their salvation, or their doom strapped to her saddle. Frank closed his eyes not to sleep, but to pray something he hadn't done since France. Not for himself, but for Margaret, for his men, for Elena, even perhaps for Blackwood, for what would be left of the man when this was finished. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the dramas playing out beneath them. Ancient and patient, they had seen it all before. The hunted and the hunters. The betrayers and the betrayed, the dead and those soon to join them. Sergeant Major Patrick Donovan knelt beside the trail fingers, tracing the faint impression of a horseshoe in the dusty soil. Behind him, Blackwood sat on his horse-iron hand, resting on the pommel, face impassive despite the heat. 4 horses, Donovan reported. 1 carrying extra weight. Probably Harmon. He took a hit back at the rocks. How old? Blackwood asked. 6, maybe 8 hours. Donovan stood brushing dust from his knees. They're pushing hard despite Harmon's condition. Heading south. Into Navajo land. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. Bold move. Or desperate. Donovan returned to his horse. Cooper's death hit the men hard, sir. They want blood. They'll have it. Blackwood's voice was cold as winter frost. But Harmon is mine. Make sure they understand that. The remaining bloodhounds, 14 men, now waited nearby, their faces grim beneath the brim of their hats. Cooper had been popular, a steady hand in chaos. His death had transformed their professional detachment into something personal. Blackwood addressed them without raising his voice, yet each word carried on the still desert air. Harmon is wounded, but still dangerous. His people are loyal and well-armed. We follow their trail south, but cautiously. Navajo territory is hostile ground for us. One of the men, a wiry sharpshooter named Hicks, spoke up. Sir, why not just let the Navajo have them? Odds are they won't make it through anyway. Because I want to see Harmon's face when he dies, Blackwood replied simply. I want him to know who killed him and why. No one had a response to that. They mounted up and continued south, following the faint trail left by the serpent riders. The land grew increasingly rugged red rock formations, rising like cathedral spires on either side of the narrow trail. Perfect ambush country. Blackwood knew it, but pressed on regardless. The iron hand that had replaced his flesh won, never tired, never weakened. It had become a symbol to his men of his resolve, his inhumanity, his willingness to sacrifice anything for victory. Even his own son. That thought came unbidden, unwelcome. Blackwood pushed it aside, focusing on the trail ahead. Thomas had known the risks when he volunteered for the escort duty, had known his father's enemies might target him, had died a soldier's death in the line of duty. It was the only way Blackwood could frame it without falling into an abyss of grief and rage that would consume him entirely. Better to channel that rage, use it as fuel for the hunt, for the reckoning to come. As the sun began to set, Donovan called a halt. The trail had led them to the edge of a vast canyon, its depths already swallowed by shadows. On the far side, perhaps a mile distant, a thin column of smoke rose against the darkening sky. Navajo camp, Donovan said, lowering his binoculars. Big one, maybe 30-40 lodges. Blackwood took the binoculars, studying the encampment. Something about its layout struck him as off, too organized, too purposeful for a simple tribal gathering. That's not just a camp, he said after a moment. That's a war party. Donovan's scarred face registered surprise, then understanding. You think Harmon's with them, that he's rallied the Navajo against us? It's what I'd do in his position. Blackwood continued scanning the canyon rim, the ravines, the approaches. And Harmon was always one of my best tactical officers, before he lost his nerve. Orders, sir. Blackwood lowered the binoculars, decision made. We make camp here. No fires. Double watches. At first light, we circle north, find a crossing, and approach the camp from the rear. And if Harmon's there, then we burn the whole camp to the ground. Blackwood's voice was matter-of-fact. Every lodge, every warrior, every horse, until we find him. Donovan nodded, turning to relay the orders. Blackwood remained at the canyon's edge, watching as the darkness swallowed the distant smoke column. Somewhere over there, Frank Harmon was planning his next move. Wounded, but still dangerous. Still a threat. Blackwood's iron hand opened and closed, a rhythmic motion he'd developed as a way to master the prosthetic. Now it was unconscious, a physical manifestation of his restless mind. Open, close. Open, close. Like a heartbeat. Like the pulse of the hunt. Blackwood had lost men before, had buried hundreds during the war, had written countless letters to grieving families, assuring them their sons had died with honor, with purpose. But Thomas was different. Thomas was his legacy, his future, his redemption. The better version of himself who would carry the Blackwood name forward, unburdened by the choices Victor had made in the mud and blood of France. Now that future was gone, snuffed out by Frank Harmon, A man who had once sworn the same oath, worn the same uniform. A man who had betrayed everything the army stood for when he refused a direct order at Heidelheim. Blackwood had never told Thomas the full story of that day, had never explained why Harmon had been court-martialed, why the village had been razed. Some truths were too heavy for sons to bear. But now with Thomas gone, those truths whispered in the canyon winds. Accusations, justifications, the weight of command decisions that could never be undone. Blackwood turned away from the canyon back to the camp where his men waited for orders, for direction, for purpose. He would give them all three, and in return they would give him Frank Harmon, dead or alive, but preferably alive, at least long enough to understand what he had taken, long enough to suffer as Blackwood was suffering, long enough to regret ever hearing the name Blackwood. The hunt would continue at dawn. Chief Thunder Sky watched the four riders approach his camp from the western ridge silhouetted against the blood-red sky. Even at a distance he recognized the lead rider's posture, a white man who sat a horse like he'd been born to it, but whose shoulders now slumped with exhaustion or injury. Frank Harmon. The Army lieutenant who had pulled Thunder Sky from a shell hole at Belleau Wood, carrying him through poison gas to the field hospital when his own men had left him for dead. Thunder Sky raised his hand and the 20 Navajo warriors positioned along the canyon rim lowered their rifles, not out of trust for the white men, but out of respect for an old debt. Frank and his men rode into the camp with the wariness of hunted animals. Their horses were foam-flecked and trembling with exhaustion. The men looked little better, dust-caked, hollow-eyed weapons held ready despite their obvious fatigue. Thunder Sky stepped forward, raising his right-hand palm outward in the universal gesture of peace. "Lieutenant Harmon," he said, his English precise despite 3 years of disuse. "The spirits said you would come." Frank dismounted carefully, one hand pressed to his side where dark blood had seeped through a makeshift bandage. "Chief Thunder Sky, it's been a long time." "France," Thunder Sky agreed. "A different war." Frank nodded, swaying slightly on his feet. "I need your help. We're being hunted." "By Blackwood." It wasn't a question. News traveled fast across the territory, carried by riders between scattered Navajo camps. "The man with the iron hand." "Yes, he's close. Maybe a day behind us." Frank's voice grew urgent. "There's a rendezvous tomorrow, sundown, an abandoned mission 20 miles east of here. My sister's life depends on us making that meeting." Thunder Sky studied the white man who had once saved him, noting the fever brightness in his eyes, the pallor beneath his trail dust. "You are wounded. You need healing before you need riding. There's no time." "There is always time for what must be done." Thunder Sky gestured to 2 of his warriors. "Take him to my lodge. The others too. Food, water, then we talk." Frank tried to protest, but his body betrayed him. He stumbled, would have fallen if Charlie hadn't caught him. The Navajo warriors moved in, supporting Frank with gentle efficiency, leading him and his men toward the center of the camp, where cook fires burned and the smell of roasting meat promised sustenance. Thunder Sky remained where he was, looking back toward the western ridge where Blackwood's forces would appear. Just as the spirits had foretold, just as they had shown him what must be done, the old war chief turned, following the others into camp. Behind him the sun finally slipped below the horizon, plunging the canyon into shadow. Night was falling, and with it the promise of blood. In Thunder Sky's lodge, Frank lay on a bed of furs, while the chief's wife, Grey Dove, tended his wound. She worked in silence, applying a poultice of herbs that burned like fire, before spreading a blessed numbness through his side. Charlie, Miles, Dwight, and Jack sat nearby, devouring bowls of stew after days of cold rations. None of them spoke, too exhausted for conversation, too wary of their hosts, despite Thunder Sky's apparent hospitality. Outside, the camp hummed with activity. Warriors painted their faces for battle. Women sharpened knives and prepared medical supplies. Children were sent to hiding places deep in the canyon, along with the elderly and infirm. Preparations for war. Thunder Sky entered the lodge, ducking beneath the low entrance. He sat cross-legged beside Frank, observing Grey Dove's work with approval. "The white man's bullet," he said, gesturing to the wound. "It carries the white man's sickness. But our medicine is older, stronger." He nodded to his wife, who withdrew, taking her herbs and bandages with her. "You will live, Lieutenant Harmon, at least until tomorrow." Frank managed a weak smile. That's all I need. Just until tomorrow. To save your sister. Thunder Sky's face remained impassive. And the woman who betrayed you. Frank's smile vanished. What woman? The Mexican. Elena. Thunder Sky made a gesture like a snake striking. Forked tongue. Two hearts. Charlie leaned forward, suddenly alert. What do you know about Elena? Thunder Sky turned his obsidian gaze to Charlie. 3 days ago, she came through our lands, riding hard, alone. His fingers sketched a map in the air. East, always east, toward the mission where you say your meeting will be. Frank struggled to sit up, wincing, as the movement pulled at his wound. She's taking the money to the rendezvous, like I ordered. She carries money, yes, and a message. Thunder Sky's voice hardened. For Blackwood, a heavy silence fell over the lodge. Frank stared at the chief, disbelief warring with a cold suspicion that had been growing since Elena had left. That's impossible, he said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. Elena's been with us from the beginning. She's one of us. Thunder Sky shook his head once. She met with Blackwood's scout, a man with a scarred face. Donovan, Charlie whispered. She gave him something, a paper, a map perhaps. Thunder Sky's eyes never left Frank's face. Then she rode on, east, always east. Frank's world tilted sideways. Elena, the only one he'd truly trusted since the war. The one who'd watched his back through a dozen firefights, who'd shared his bed, who knew his deepest fears and greatest hopes. A traitor. She knows where the rendezvous is, he said, his voice hollow. She'll lead Blackwood straight to Margaret. Charlie cursed low and vicious. I knew it. I knew we couldn't trust her with that money. It was never about the money. Frank's mind was racing now, piecing together a puzzle whose solution had been staring him in the face all along. It was about Margaret, about me. He turned back to Thunder Sky. How long have you known? The spirits showed me when she passed through our lands. Thunder Sky's expression softened slightly. I would have sent a runner to warn you, but the spirits said you would come to us. Frank nodded, accepting the Navajo's logic on its own terms. And Blackwood, where is he now? Camped beyond the northern rim, 15, maybe 20 men. Thunder Sky's lips curved in a cold smile. They think they watch us, but we watch them. So they found you. Frank's tactical mind was already adjusting, calculating new odds, new possibilities. But they don't know we're here. Not yet, but they will come at dawn. Blackwood's way. Thunder Sky stood his considerable height, making the lodge seem suddenly smaller. We will be ready. The question is, will you fight with us, or will you run to save your sister? It was the question that had been haunting Frank since they'd entered Navajo territory. The impossible choice between his men, his allies, and his blood. I need to reach that rendezvous, he said finally. But I won't leave you to face Blackwood alone. Thunder Sky nodded as if Frank had passed some unspoken test. Then we make a plan. Together. As we did in France. He swept aside a buffalo robe, revealing a patch of smooth earth. With a stick, he began to draw a map of the canyon and surrounding territory. Blackwood will come from the north. Here. The stick marked an X. The only approach for men on horses. My warriors will be waiting. Here and here. More marks indicating ambush positions. But we will let some pass. Draw them in. Frank studied the crude map, professional assessment overriding his physical pain. You're creating a killing ground. Yes. Thunder Sky's face was stone. But not for all. Blackwood we leave for you. He looked up at Frank. That is your wish, yes, to face the Iron Hand yourself. Frank nodded slowly. Yes, but I need 3 men to ride with me to the mission. For Margaret. Charlie, Thunder Sky said without hesitation. The one with the talking gun. He gestured to the Thompson. He will go with you. The others stay to fight. Charlie looked to Frank, who nodded once. No arguments, no debates. The decision was made. And who else? Thunder Sky asked. Frank's eyes moved to Miles, the youngest, the fastest, the one with the least history with Blackwood. Miles, and Dwight for his steady hand. Jack accepted his exclusion without complaint, understanding the logic behind it. I'll give these army boys something to remember me by, he promised, patting the dynamite sticks he still carried. Thunder Sky stood the plan settled. Rest now. Heal. At dawn we paint our faces together. As brothers, not cheers phone. After the chief left, the 5 serpent riders sat in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts. The revelation of Elena's betrayal hung heavy in the air, a wound deeper than any bullet could inflict. I should have seen it, Frank said finally, his voice barely audible. Should have known. She fooled all of us, Dwight offered gruffly. Played her part well. Frank shook his head. I was closest to her. Should have sensed something wrong. His fist clenched on the fur beneath him. Now Margaret pays the price for my blindness. We don't know that yet, Charlie said. Elena might still be planning to make the exchange with Pierce. Keep the money for herself after. No. Frank's certainty was absolute. This was never about the money. Elena's working for Blackwood. Has been all along. The pieces were falling into place now, a pattern clear in retrospect. That's how they found us so quickly after Devil's Creek. How they knew which way we'd go after redemption. Why, though? Miles asked, confusion plain on his young face. What does Blackwood want besides killing you? Margaret? Frank closed his eyes briefly, the truth sickening him. He wants to take from me what I took from him. A life for a life. Thomas for Margaret. The logic was brutal but undeniable. The symmetry of vengeance. So what's the play? Charlie asked. We still riding for the mission tomorrow? Yes, but not as expected. Frank's mind was already formulating a new plan, one born of desperation and rage. Elena thinks she's leading Blackwood to me through Margaret. We're going to turn the trap back on them. He outlined his idea simple, direct, lethal. The others listened in silence, understanding that they had crossed a threshold. This was no longer about escape, about starting fresh somewhere beyond Blackwood's reach. This was about ending it, once and for all. When Frank finished speaking, Charlie nodded slowly. It might work, if we time it right. If Elena sticks to the plan, she will. She's too committed now to back out. Frank's voice hardened. And Blackwood won't be able to resist the bait. What about Pierce? Dwight asked. He's still holding Margaret. Pierce is a businessman. When he sees what's coming, he'll cut his losses and run. Frank's certainty was absolute. It's Margaret I'm worried about. What he might do to her before he leaves. Then we'd better not be late, Miles said, his young face set with determination. They spent the rest of the night planning, checking weapons, preparing for what would likely be their final ride together. Outside, the Navajo camp continued its own preparations, the quiet efficiency of a people who had been fighting and surviving for centuries. Dawn came too soon, painting the canyon walls with pale gold light. Frank stood outside Thunder Sky's lodge, watching as the Navajo warriors applied their war paint, streaks of red, white, and black that transformed human faces into something otherworldly, terrifying. Thunder Sky approached, offering a small clay pot of the same paint. For you, he said, and your men. Frank dipped his fingers into the red ochre, drawing a single line across his forehead. The other serpent riders followed suit, each man marked now as a warrior of Thunder Sky's band, bound by blood and paint and common purpose. Blackwood comes, a scout reported, sliding down from the canyon rim. Many men, many guns. Thunder Sky nodded, unsurprised. Take your positions, he ordered his warriors. Then to Frank, you should go, now, while they focus on us. Frank gripped the chief's forearm in the warrior's handshake they had shared once before in the mud of Bellow Wood. Thank you, my friend, for everything. We are even now, Thunder Sky replied. No more debts between us. Frank, Charlie, Miles, and Dwight mounted fresh horses provided by the Navajo. Their wounds had been treated, their weapons cleaned and loaded, their resolve hardened by a night of preparation for what was to come. As they rode east, following a narrow trail that would take them around Blackwood's forces, the sounds of battle erupted behind them, the sharp crack of rifles, the deeper boom of shotguns, the ancient war cries of the Navajo warriors as they sprang their trap. Frank didn't look back. His focus was fixed on the horizon, on the abandoned mission, where Elena waited, where Margaret's fate would be decided, where his reckoning with Blackwood would finally come. The abandoned mission stood alone on a dusty rise, its adobe walls baked golden by centuries of sun, its bell tower reaching toward a sky painted in shades of crimson and purple as the sun descended. Once a place of prayer and contemplation, it had been deserted for decades, left to the mercy of the elements and the occasional traveler seeking shelter. Today it would witness a different kind of communion, a sacrament of blood and vengeance. Elena Reyes sat on the mission's front steps, a Winchester rifle across her knees, watching the eastern approach. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, her riding clothes dusty but intact. At her feet lay a saddlebag, presumably containing the money from Henderson's safe. Inside the mission's single room, Maxwell Pierce paced like a caged predator. He was a tall man, immaculately dressed, despite the frontier setting, with the cold eyes of a snake and the manicured hands of someone who had others do his killing for him. Beside the altar, Margaret Harmon sat on a wooden chair. Her wrist bound her face, bearing a fading bruise. She was Frank's opposite in coloring fair, where he was dark, delicate, where he was weathered, but they shared the same determined set to their jaw, the same unflinching gaze. "He's not coming," Pierce said, checking his pocket watch for the dozenth time. "The sun's almost down." Elena didn't look away from the horizon. "He'll be here." "You sound very certain for someone who betrayed him." Pierce's voice dripped with disdain. "What makes you think he survived Blackwood's ambush?" Now Elena turned her eyes as cold as the banker's. "Because I know Frank Harmon. Better than you. Better than Blackwood. He doesn't die easily." "Everyone dies easily with enough bullets." Pierce resumed his pacing. "That was the agreement. You lead Blackwood to Harmon, I get my money, and you get your freedom. And what about me?" Margaret's voice was steady despite her circumstances. "What do I get out of this arrangement?" Pierce smiled, revealing teeth too perfect to be real. "Why, my dear, you get to live, provided your brother brings my money." Margaret's laugh was a brittle thing. "You're a poor liar, Mr. Pierce. We both know you have no intention of letting either of us walk out of here." Pierce's smile never wavered. "Such a pessimist. But then you Harmons always did see the worst in people. Only when it's there to see." Margaret's eyes shifted to Elena. "He trusted you, you know, even when others had doubts." Elena's face remained impassive, but something flickered in her eyes, regret perhaps, or calculation. "Your brother's a fool. Always has been, thinking he could stand against men like Blackwood, men like Pierce. And yet here you are, waiting for him." Margaret's insight cut like a blade. "Still afraid of him despite everything." Elena turned back to the horizon. "The only thing I fear is dying in this God-forsaken territory. Once this is finished, I'll be on a train to Mexico City with enough money to live like a queen." "If Blackwood lets you live that long," Margaret observed. Before Elena could respond, a cloud of dust appeared on the eastern horizon. Riders moving fast. "There," she said, rising to her feet. "Just as I promised." Pierce joined her at the steps, field glasses raised. "3 riders. Where's the 4th?" Elena frowned, counting again. "There were 5 of them at Devil's Creek. One must have been killed in the fighting. Or they've split up." Pierce lowered the glasses, suddenly wary. "This could be a trap." Elena shook her head. "No. Frank would never risk his sister's life on a clever plan. He'll come straight in, offer the money, try to negotiate." Her hand moved to the pistol at her hip. "That's when you take Margaret out back, and I give the signal to Blackwood's men. And Harmon dies knowing he was betrayed. By me." Elena's voice was flat, emotionless. "That's what Blackwood wants. What he's paying for." Pierce seemed satisfied with this explanation. He returned inside, grabbing Margaret roughly by the arm. "Time to greet your brother, my dear. Remember, one wrong word, one hint of warning, and I put a bullet in your spine." Margaret said nothing, her face a mask of controlled fear and desperate hope. Outside, Frank, Charlie, and Miles approached the mission at a steady walk, making no attempt at concealment. Dwight was nowhere to be seen, positioned somewhere in the surrounding hills with his rifle as Frank's plan required. Frank raised his hand as they drew near, bringing their small party to a halt 30 yards from the steps where Elena waited, rifle still across her knees. "Elena," he called, his voice carrying easily in the still evening air. "I see you made it safely." "No thanks to you," she replied, "leaving me alone with all that money. Some might call that a test." "Some might." Frank's eyes moved past her to the mission entrance where Pierce now stood with Margaret. "I have what you want, Pierce. Let my sister go." Pierce's laugh was as cold as his eyes. "Come now, Harmon. We both know that's not how this works. The money first, then we discuss your sister's future. Frank dismounted slowly, his movements stiff from his wound, his face revealing nothing of the rage and grief that churned within him. Charlie and Miles remained on their horses, hands near their weapons, but making no threatening moves. The money's in my saddlebag, Frank said, untying a leather pouch from his saddle. 30,000 as agreed. He walked forward, pouch in hand. Elena tensed visibly, her finger moving to the Winchester's trigger guard. That's close enough, she said when he was 10 paces away. Toss it here. Frank stopped, studied her face. All this time, he said quietly, since France. A flicker of something shame, perhaps, crossed Elena's features before disappearing behind her mask of indifference. Blackwood found me in a field hospital, offered me a choice, spy for him or be turned over to the authorities as an enemy alien. She shrugged. It wasn't a difficult decision. And us, what we shared. War makes for strange bedfellows. Her voice was cold, but her eyes betrayed her. Nothing personal, Frank, just survival. Frank nodded slowly, as if finally understanding something that had eluded him. I want to see Margaret up close. Make sure she's unharmed. Pierce pushed Margaret forward, his hand gripping her arm tightly. See, alive and well. Now the money. Frank tossed the pouch. It landed at Elena's feet with a heavy thud. She picked it up one-handed, the rifle still trained on Frank. Open it, Pierce ordered. Count it. Elena did as instructed, keeping the rifle pointed at Frank while she verified the contents with her free hand. It's here, all of it. Pierce smiled, victorious. Excellent. Now as to your sister. A shot rang out from the distant hills. Pierce's head snapped back, a red mist blooming where his left eye had been. He crumpled to the ground, dead before he hit the dust. Everything happened at once. Margaret threw herself flat, as Frank had instructed her to do if gunfire erupted. Charlie and Miles drew their weapons, providing covering fire, as Frank lunged forward, tackling Elena before she could bring her rifle to bear. They hit the ground hard, Frank's superior weight pinning her despite her desperate struggles. The Winchester went flying, skittering across the packed earth. You're too late, Elena gasped, still fighting. Blackwood's men are already here, watching, waiting. I know, Frank said, his voice deadly calm. That's what I'm counting on. In the distance, a new sound rose above the gunfire, the mission's bell ringing out across the desert. The signal Dwight had been waiting for after making his kill shot on Pierce. Explosions rocked the hillsides surrounding the mission. The dynamite charges Jack had helped plant before dawn, now detonated by Dwight. Screams followed as Blackwood's hidden men found themselves caught in a trap of Frank's design. Elena's eyes widened with the realization that she had miscalculated badly. How did you know Thunder Sky saw you meet with Donovan? Frank's grip on her wrist tightened. The Navajo miss very little that happens in their territory. Genuine fear replaced the calculation in Elena's eyes. Frank, please. Blackwood forced me, threatened me. You know I wouldn't. Save it. Frank's voice was ice. Where is he? Elena hesitated, then nodded toward the bell tower. Up there, watching, waiting for you to break when you saw Margaret die. Frank looked up at the tower silhouetted against the darkening sky. He could almost feel Blackwood's gaze upon him, cold and implacable, as the iron hand that had become his signature. Charlie, he called, get Margaret inside. Miles, watch the perimeter. He bound Elena's hands with her own belt, leaving her face down in the dust. Don't move, he warned. My men aren't feeling particularly merciful toward traitors right now. Then he was moving, pistol drawn toward the mission entrance. The adobe walls offered some protection from the scattered gunfire still erupting around the perimeter where Miles engaged the surviving bloodhounds. Inside the mission was a single large room, now dim with approaching night. The altar stood at the far end beneath a simple wooden cross. To the right, a narrow staircase led up to the bell tower. Charlie had taken Margaret to cover behind the altar, already cutting her bonds with his hunting knife. She looked up as Frank entered, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Frank, she whispered, half disbelieving. You came. Said I would, didn't I? He managed a tight smile, dropping to one knee beside her. Are you hurt? She shook her head. Nothing that won't heal. Her eyes moved to his side where blood had seeped through his bandage during the fight with Elena. "You're wounded." "Nothing that won't heal," he echoed. "Charlie, get her out the back way. There's a ravine that leads east. Dwight will cover you." Charlie nodded, helping Margaret to her feet. "What about you?" Frank's eyes moved to the bell tower stairs. "I have unfinished business." "Frank, no." Margaret gripped his arm. "You've done enough. Let's just go. All of us." He touched her cheek gently. "It doesn't end until Blackwood does. You know that." She did. He could see it in her eyes, the same clear-eyed assessment of reality that had kept them both alive since their parents' death. "Then come back to me," she said simply. "Promise. I promise." Whether he believed it or not was irrelevant. It was what she needed to hear. Charlie led her toward the back of the mission where a small door opened onto the desert beyond. Frank watched them go, then turned to the bell tower stairs. Each step creaked beneath his weight, announcing his approach. He made no attempt at stealth. This confrontation had been brewing since Heidelheim, since the moment he had refused to become the monster Blackwood had demanded. The tower room was small, open to the elements on all sides to allow the bell sound to carry. Blackwood stood with his back to the stairs, gazing out at the battle still raging around the mission's perimeter. His iron hand rested on the bell rope, a mockery of the priests who had once called the faithful to prayer. "Lieutenant Harmon," he said without turning. "Right on schedule." Frank kept his pistol raised, aimed at the center of Blackwood's back. "It's over, Colonel. Your men are dead or scattered. Elena's captive. There's nowhere left to run." "Hey, who's running?" Blackwood turned slowly, his face impassive in the fading light. He wore no sidearm, no visible weapon, just his uniform cleaned and pressed for this moment, and the iron hand that gleamed dully at his side. "I came here for you, Frank. Only you." "Because of Thomas." Frank kept the pistol steady. "An eye for an eye. Is that what you think this is about, simple revenge?" Blackwood's laugh was hollow. "Thomas was a soldier. He died a soldier's death. I accepted that the moment I identified his body." "Then why," Frank demanded, "why hunt us across 3 territories? Why kill innocent people?" "Because you're a disease, Frank. A corruption that spreads." Blackwood's voice remained calm, reasonable, as if explaining a simple truth to a child. "What you did at Heidelheim, countermanding my orders, sparing those civilians, it wasn't mercy. It was weakness. And weakness gets more soldiers killed." "Oh no, those were women and children." Frank said the old argument, feeling both tired and vital. "Unarmed, terrified. They were harboring snipers who had killed 12 of our men." Blackwood's iron hand clenched into a fist. "The rules of war are clear. Civilians who aid the enemy become the enemy. There were no snipers, you knew that." Frank's certainty was absolute. "You wanted to make an example, to spread terror, like you've been doing here." Blackwood didn't deny it. "Terror is a weapon like any other, more efficient than bullets sometimes." His cold eyes assessed Frank. "You're bleeding, Lieutenant. Your wound has reopened." Frank ignored the observation. "It's time to finish this, one way or another." "Indeed." Blackwood took a step forward. "But not with that." He nodded to the pistol. "If you're going to kill me, do it as a soldier, face to face, man to man." Frank hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to pull the trigger to end Blackwood's threat permanently. But something held him back, some vestige of the officer's code they had once shared. "No tricks," he warned, lowering the pistol slightly. "No hidden weapons. Just this." Blackwood raised his iron hand. "Against whatever you bring to the fight." Frank holstered his pistol. "Then let's finish it." Blackwood moved with surprising speed for a man his age, closing the distance between them in 2 long strides. The iron hand swung in a vicious arc, aimed at Frank's head. Frank ducked, feeling the wind of its passage, countering with a sharp jab to Blackwood's ribs. The older man grunted but didn't slow, pivoting to bring the iron hand around in a backhand strike. This time it connected the metal knuckles, raking across Frank's cheek, drawing blood. Frank staggered, his wounded side, screaming in protest as he twisted to avoid a follow-up blow. They circled each other in the confined space of the bell tower, each looking for an opening, a weakness to exploit. Below, the sounds of battle had diminished to sporadic gunfire. The sun had set completely now, the tower illuminated only by starlight and the rising moon. You're favoring your right side, Blackwood observed. The wound is worse than you're letting on. Worried about a fair fight, Colonel, Frank taunted, trying to draw him in. Blackwood didn't take the bait. He advanced methodically, the iron hand always moving, always threatening. There's no such thing as a fair fight. Only winners and losers, living and dead. He lunged suddenly, the iron hand aimed at Frank's wounded side. Frank sidestepped, but slower than he should have. The metal fingers caught his shirt, tearing fabric and reopening the wound beneath. Fresh pain lanced through Frank, nearly driving him to his knees. He countered on instinct, his fist connecting with Blackwood's jaw, rocking the older man back. Blackwood spat blood, his cold composure finally cracking. You should have died at Heidelheim, he snarled. With the rest of your men. The words hit Frank like a physical blow. What are you talking about? My men were court-martialed, discharged. Is that what you believed? Blackwood's laugh was ugly. How convenient for your conscience. No, Lieutenant. After you were removed from command, I had them executed for cowardice in the face of the enemy. The world seemed to tilt beneath Frank's feet. His men boys, most of them following his lead in refusing an illegal order, executed, while he had been locked in a stockade awaiting court-martial. Rage surged through him, hot and cleansing. He charged Blackwood, driving him back against the bell tower's low wall. The iron hand came up between them, pressing against Frank's throat, cutting off his air. That's it, Blackwood hissed, his face inches from Frank's. Feel it, the hate, the animal inside you. His eyes gleamed in the moonlight. You're no different from me, Frank. We just draw the line in different places. Frank's vision began to darken at the edges as the iron fingers crushed his windpipe. With the last of his strength, he drove his knee up into Blackwood's groin. The pressure on his throat eased as Blackwood doubled over. Frank gasped for air, stumbling back, one hand going to his throat where the metal fingers had left deep impressions. Blackwood recovered quickly, rage replacing his usual cold control. He charged Frank, driving him back toward the stairs. Frank's heel caught on the top step, and for a terrible moment, he teetered on the edge of falling. Blackwood pressed his advantage, the iron hand reaching for Frank's face. Frank caught his wrist, the two men locked together at the top of the stairs, their faces inches apart. You took everything from me, Frank rasped, his voice raw from the choking. My career, my men, years of my life. And you took my son, Blackwood countered, straining against Frank's grip. The only pure thing I ever made in this world. Thomas died a soldier. You said it yourself. Frank felt his strength ebbing, the wound in his side, a furnace of pain. But my men, they died as examples, sacrifices to your ego. Something flickered in Blackwood's eyes. Not remorse exactly, but a recognition. A moment of clarity. War makes monsters of us all, Lieutenant, he said, his voice suddenly tired. Some of us just take to it more naturally than others. With a final surge of strength, Frank pushed Blackwood away from the stairs. The colonel stumbled back, regaining his balance near the tower's edge. His face settled into its familiar mask of cold control. Finish it then, he said, spreading his arms. Become what you've always feared. What I've always seen in you? Frank drew his pistol, aimed it at Blackwood's heart. His hand was steady despite his exhaustion, his wounds, the blood loss that made the world seem distant and unreal. One pull of the trigger, and it would be over. Margaret would be safe. The ghosts of his executed men might find some peace. The nightmare that had begun at Heidelheim would finally end. Well, Blackwood prompted, a hint of mockery in his voice. What are you waiting for? Frank lowered the pistol slowly. You took my mother, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. You took my son. Now we're even. But if you're still breathing, it's because I let you live to learn how to die a little each day in your head. Confusion, then understanding, crossed Blackwood's face. You think this ends here, that I'll just let you walk away? No. Frank holstered his pistol. I think you'll live with what you've done, with what you've become, with the knowledge that in the end, I was stronger than you. He turned toward the stairs, his back to Blackwood. A final insult, a final judgment. Behind him, Blackwood roared a sound of pure rage and despair. Frank heard the rush of movement, felt the displacement of air, as the colonel charged him, the iron hand raised for a killing blow. Frank pivoted at the last moment, using Blackwood's momentum against him. a simple move taught in basic training. The colonel's own weight carried him past Frank toward the low wall of the bell tower. For a moment, Blackwood teetered on the edge arms, windmilling the iron hand gleaming in the moonlight. His eyes met Frank's, wide with surprise and something like respect. Then he was gone, his body plummeting to the hard-packed earth below. The impact made a sound like a ripe melon dropped from a great height. Frank stood at the edge, looking down at Blackwood's broken form. The colonel's eyes stared up at the stars already glazing over in death. The iron hand lay palm up beside him, fingers curled as if reaching for something just beyond grasp. "Lieutenant," Charlie's voice came from the base of the tower. "You okay up there?" Frank stepped back from the edge. "It's done," he called down. "Blackwood's dead." He made his way down the narrow stairs, each step an agony as the adrenaline faded and his wounds reasserted themselves. Outside, he found Charlie Miles and Dwight waiting with Margaret. Elena sat apart from them, hands still bound her face, a mask of defeat. "The bloodhounds," Frank asked. "What's left of them scattered when they saw the colonel fall," Dwight reported. "Don't think they have much fight left without him." Frank nodded, too exhausted for words. Margaret came to him, supporting him as he swayed on his feet. "What now?" she asked softly. Frank looked at Elena, at Pierce's body still sprawled in the dust, at the mission standing, silent witness to yet another chapter of human violence. "Now we leave," he said simply. "All of this. Behind us." "And her," Charlie nodded toward Elena. Frank considered the woman who had shared his bed, his plans, his dreams, who had betrayed him to Blackwood out of fear or ambition or some complex mixture of both. "She goes free," he decided, "with nothing. Let her live with what she's done." Elena's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in calculation. Always calculating even now. "And the money?" Miles asked. "Divide it," Frank said. "Equal shares. Then we separate. Safer that way." They understood. The bond that had held the Serpent Riders together, survival, vengeance, loyalty to Frank, had served its purpose. It was time for new beginnings, individual ones. As dawn broke over the mission, 5 riders departed in different directions. Frank and Margaret headed north toward the Navajo lands, where Thunder Sky had promised them sanctuary until Frank's wounds healed. Behind them, the mission stood silhouetted against the rising sun, its bell tower empty, now its purpose served. Like the war that had shaped them all, it belonged to history now, to memory. Frank didn't look back. The weight of Thomas Blackwood's wallet was gone from his pocket, buried with its owner beneath the hard desert soil. The ghosts of Heidelheim would never fully leave him, but perhaps now they might grant him some peace. Beside him, Margaret rode in silence, respecting his need for quiet contemplation. Ahead, the mountains rose like a promise, a place to heal, to begin again, to become something other than what the war had made him. A place where no one would call him Rattler anymore.